My name is Audrey Cherkov, and I'm the Managing Director of the Women's Forum. Welcome to the last, but not least, in our series of fireside chats with the New York Times for this year. Amid the current humanitarian crisis, women and girls in Afghanistan are losing freedoms that many of us take for granted. Freedom to move, freedom to study, and freedom to work. And because women are crucial to peace and economic progress, an uncertain future for Afghan women and girls is an uncertain future for Afghanistan itself. The Women's Forum stands in solidarity with Afghanistan's women who need the freedom and the means to choose their own future. So today, we turn the floor over to two remarkable Afghan women leaders and experts from different sectors. Never before has it been more important to highlight women leaders in their own words on what is next for Afghan women and what the world can do. Our conversation today is moderated by New York Times journalist Amanda Taub. Amanda, over to you.
Thank you so much, Audrey. As I'm sure everyone watching from home agrees, the events in Afghanistan over the past couple of weeks have been devastating to watch, but now the world's attention is turning to the future and what might be coming next. So I am so pleased that we have two amazing women who can speak both from their own experience and also from their positions as experts on Afghan peace and security for women. First, we have Manizha Wafeq, who is the head of the Women's Chamber of the Afghanistan Women's Chamber of Commerce and Industry. She is both an entrepreneur in her own right and somebody who has worked to create economic opportunities for hundreds of other women in Afghanistan, and also worked directly with the former government to create paths to both economic and political power for women there. And then we also have Rina Amiri, who is a senior fellow at the NYU Center for International Cooperation. She's an expert on peace and security and mediation. And both of them are, I'm just really looking forward to what both of them have to say. So I wanted to start out this conversation by turning the floor over to them immediately and just asking them to take a couple of minutes to outline what they think the most important issues are looking forward for women and girls in Afghanistan at this moment of extreme political turbulence. So Manizha, why don't we begin with you?
Yes, sure, Amanda. Thank you. Since I'm representing Afghan women in private sector, which is something not much spoken about, and there's very few awareness among our international partners, and as well as within Afghanistan, that there are a great number of women-owned businesses in the country. So let me start with giving you some statistics and numbers. In the last 20 years, from 2002 to 2021, from zero, we have today over 2,471 formal businesses in Afghanistan, owned and run by women. And these businesses are in all sectors. By all sectors, I mean all non-traditional sectors. You just name it: logistics, IT, media services, private schools, private clinics, exporting, manufacturing, everything. And we have, by now, we have had over 54,500 informal businesses in the country, majority of whom were in agriculture and handicraft businesses. And the overall journey for us to start Afghanistan Women's Chamber of Commerce with the aim to really advocate and represent women in businesses' interests in the policy-making level. It started all over from 2007 when I first time attended a program called Peace Through Business here in the United States. And in 2009, we put together a small association of our alumni. And then from 2009 all the way to 2017, when we changed these smaller associations into a bigger platform, and then finally to Afghanistan Women's Chamber of Commerce. And for the last 4.5 years, that we have been able to achieve a number of policy changes and have done a number of one-on-one business development services with women were really remarkable. I mean, I am one of the founders of this organization and have been part of this whole movement for all these years, for the last 15 years. But I'm saying it today with a lot of pride that we were able to bring a lot of changes in women's lives, and we had a lot of plans and as well as a lot of hopes to continue doing those. And so you know, from 3 weeks ago, talking about plans such as a Women's National Business Agenda, a long-term strategy to see how we can improve business women's lives in Afghanistan, to now talking about evacuations and women's access to security and safe places, and unfortunately talking about how we can start all over again to really advocate and lobby women's position and business in Afghanistan.
Thank you so much. And now, Rina, if we could turn it over to you, if you would like to take a few minutes to frame what you see as kind of the crucial issues looking forward to the next period in Afghanistan.
Well, thank you very much first for the opportunity. You know, what I'm most struck with is just what you began with, that Afghan women's voices have been silenced overnight. And I was on the phone with my friends in Afghanistan for the last several weeks. And throughout the country, because I was doing a research project on inclusive ceasefires, and had the opportunity to talk to these women as province after district after district, province after province was falling. And these women, you know, many of them had been quite hopeful that what we would see is a rehabilitated Taliban. Some of them had actually engaged the Taliban in talks in Doha and in Oslo, and they were devastated that their provinces and their districts were falling as quickly as they were. But there was a sense of cautious hope that things might not turn out to be as bad as they feared. But what they witnessed, and place after place, is that one of the first things that the Taliban forces would do was to go to women's organizations, to their houses, with lists saying, "We know what you're doing, and we, you know, you're under watch," and that was enough to strike utter terror in their hearts. And it was that the Taliban didn't even have to carry out acts of intimidation. It was just by visiting them, they were triggering memories of what the Taliban did when they were last in power. And it was enough to silence people overnight throughout the entire country. They were not only fearful for themselves, but for their families. And I saw this happening place after place. And then in Kabul, I was on the phone that morning when Kabul was falling. And some of the women who were the most resilient that I had never seen a moment of fragility, just seeing them break down and just have a tremendous raw fear of what was going to happen to their families. They're very courageous people, so they weren't. Some of them were quite stoic about themselves, but it was their families that was at risk, that they feared. And overnight, they went from being outspoken, being on social media, being activists and advocates and leaders, to being virtual prisoners in their home, because they simply had to shut everything down, including their social media, out of fear of the consequences. This should not be taken lightly. You know, I'm struck by. I spend a lot of time both speaking to the policy community and to the activist community, which is women and human rights defenders. And there's very different conversations happening. And the policy community, which is, overwhelmingly men. What I'm hearing is, the most important thing is that we have to stabilize the situation. It's not so bad. The Taliban are practicing restraint, and they're rather dismissive of what I'm hearing from women and the community of human rights defenders in terms of what's taking place. And I think there's just such a sense of urgency to quickly mobilize around the Taliban, because there's a greater fear of ISIS now. There's the good force and the bad force. And now the good force is the Taliban, the bad force is the ISIS. And there are some very realistic concerns as well. There's a humanitarian situation that's very devastating, that's going to affect both the women and men. And there's a sense that, okay, we have to quickly help the Taliban consolidate power so that they can address these challenges. And while I'm also a pragmatist and I'm also a policymaker, and so I understand that perspective, and I appreciate the urgency of the situation. But what I fear is that once again, we're going to see what we saw during the peace process, which is for the expediency of what was called a peace process, which was not a peace process. It was an exit strategy on the part of the US and the international community, and it was a PR strategy on the part of the Taliban. And they were not made to abide by any conditions and any terms, and they were able to make the case that they had fulfilled the terms of the agreement. And we are where we are as a result of that. And my fear is that once again, we're going to end up in this position, which would mean really eliminating any hope that we can at least hold the Taliban to account, at least in terms of the commitments they've made that they're going to protect or that they will enable the rights of women and the rest of the country. And so I would say that we have to proceed with great caution. There's a lot, there's a political crisis, an economic crisis, a humanitarian crisis, yet at the same time, we have to be strategic. We have to step back. The key, and Manizha John can tell you, to stabilizing Afghanistan, both I would argue economically in terms of everything that she is doing, and politically, and engendering a moderate country that doesn't fall prey to extremism, is empowering women and the moderating forces of Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And so I think both of you have touched on in these opening statements in different ways this kind of global discussion that is now happening about whether the current iteration of the Taliban, what can really be expected of them, and in particular, what incentives they will be responsive to as they kind of consolidate control and begin to set up a government. So we have an audience question coming in from a journalist for Women in Life magazine about whether the Taliban are likely to make good on their suggestion that women might be able to join the government. And I would like to broaden that a little bit to ask what constituencies within Afghanistan and within the international community might be able to find leverage to put pressure on the Taliban to allow women to have that role in public life and genuine power within that role. So I would be very interested in both of your perspectives, both about, what would give women access to a public role in the policy and government community, but also in economic life, because I think we all know that economic power is a vital component for any kind of stability of female empowerment. So Manizha, do you want to take the first stab at that, talking about economic power and leverage with the Taliban?
Yes. So first of all, let's look at what condition Taliban has already put forward. The condition of segregation of men and women's spaces, and the condition of women having male accompanying them everywhere. And so with those conditions, which are not practical and every sphere. It might be practical with schools. We already have had our schools, primary to high school, segregated. We had girls' schools and boys' schools. At universities, it was not segregated, it was together. And so let's say that can be a little bit, practical in terms of really separating classes for girls and boys. But then coming to the economic sphere, factories, businesses everywhere, women were making 20% of employees of our banking sector, our telecom sector, and majority of our other major export commodities, carpet. Okay, carpet, let's say they were working at home, they will continue working at home. But saffron, one of those expensive spices in the world, and Afghanistan was leading it in the past few years, the saffron export sector. So that was 80-90% of that job was done by women, and it was outside. First, collecting everything from the farms, and then again outside home, it was in those processing centers where they were processing these saffron and packaging these saffrons. 80% of the job was done by women. And so so considering how practical one of their first proposal of segregation is in the economy, I don't see at all that it's practical. And so that worries me and worries everyone else at home and all the businesses, our women-owned businesses. Like I told you the number, with 2,471 formal and over 54,500 informal, altogether over 57,000 businesses owned and run by women, and they have created over 130,000 jobs for men and women. And so in these businesses, both men and women were working, women were leading. And so I don't know how practical now that condition would be with them to really continue these businesses. And
just on that point, I'd love to ask a follow-up question, which is, you're describing what is in the aggregate a fairly significant, economic group and economic power, but also one that I know is very much distributed across many small businesses. So are there efforts that you see or organizations that you see that might have the capability to kind of aggregate that economic power and speak with a loud voice on behalf of the women who work in those sectors, particularly for exports that might lead to foreign currency,
Sure, we do. We have our chambers in Afghanistan. These chambers represent, apart from our chamber, of course, we majorly and solely represent Afghan women in business. But then we have all these other chambers, our Chamber of Commerce and Investment, our Chamber of Mines and Industries. Those are the ones that are representing all these factories, exporters that I'm talking about, whose major part of employees are women. And so those chambers, if they want to, as male champions, that they have always expressed that they are supportive of women's role in the economy and women being outside and women's economic empowerment. If they want to, they have the leverage to speak to Taliban. Currently, all those other chambers are working with the current appointed Minister of Industry and Commerce by Taliban. Apart from us, we had requested for a meeting. We received the meeting time. This is a good information for all of you. We received the meeting time from this minister, and we submitted a list of 25-30 business women to go and meet him. And only in an hour of the meeting, he canceled the meeting. He said, oh, he got into something urgent. He will get back to us with a new time. But then, of course, all of us know that he did not have anything to tell us because he did not have any permission from his leaders whether to allow business women to resume their work or not. So apart from us trying at this moment to really get hold of whoever the leaders are in Kabul, to speak to them and negotiate our position, our other chambers have the leverage because they are the ones who would be equal partner of the international partners bringing money into Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And that's so important. That's something that I haven't seen surfaced in very many places, where so much of the kind of international coverage is focused on just government actors. But you've made an excellent point that there are, not just one, but many private sector organizations that will have real influence as members of civil society. So Rina, if we could now turn to you to talk about the policy sector and what role women might be able to gain there, and if there are civil society organizations or other channels that might be able to kind of have some leverage to bring women's voices into the conversation. Oh, and you're muted. You need to unmute.
Thank you. Sorry. Now, it's a good question, because so far we've been focusing a lot on the international leverage, sanctions, aid, recognition, and I think those are important. It's just may not be as significant as we think, because I think there's a couple of different constituencies. So certainly they are still courting the West, because they, more than anything else, I think they want funding. I don't think that they're too worried that they're going to get sanctions right now, because they're holding a gun to their head, and that gun is ISIS, and they feel that the recognition is on its way. The other constituency, of course, is the region, and the region has made it very, very clear that they're going to be not holding many conditions for them. China has already made it very clear that they're going to be recognizing the Taliban, and as Russia, Pakistan certainly. And then there's a third very important constituency, which is looking inside the country as to which forces they may have contend with. Now, unfortunately, in terms of civil society, I mean, I think most of the leaders of the advances that have been achieved over the last 2 decades, most of them are on their way out, or they're sheltering. They have been, I mean, the Taliban have turned out to be, there is a Taliban 2.0, but it's a very strategic, and in some way it's more menacing to Taliban. And they knew what they had to do in terms of really going after the top leadership of civil society, women, journalists, and those that were at the forefront of the gains achieved, and frightening them enough that they, that they're either on their way, they're out, or on their way out. But that leaves another element, which is the more traditional community. What I've heard from some, that in parts of the country where there's a strong leadership, whether it's the tribal leadership or the community leadership that they have to contend with, that they have been less intrusive. In parts of and it's uneven. I don't want to make a blanket statement, but if, for example, in Nimruz of Kandahar and other places where the community has stepped forward and has said, you can come, but you're not going to interrupt so much, of the things that we have in place. They have still tried to set some terms, but they've been more flexible and responsive to the community, saying that we can manage this, and these areas are more traditional. And my sense, so that's one element. And then of course there's the political leadership, where the Taliban has said that they're going to be developing some sort of, I wouldn't call it a unity government, but that they would be inclusive of some of those actors, which would be the former President Karzai, possibly Dr. Abdullah. And the question is, to what degree are they going to make a commitment to inclusivity themselves? And I think that's a really open question. And then finally, I don't want to discount the role of women themselves. One of the women during the 90s, even the most difficult circumstances, there is a resilience, there is a leadership, and they will, I would expect that if the Taliban also turn out to be sort of a softer version that they're promising, I think that those leaders will come out and will try to negotiate space for themselves.
Thank you. That is so helpful. And so we have a couple more questions about what the kind of space for women to maneuver, not necessarily in the public sector, but even as individuals might look like. So we have one question about the expectations for women to continue their education, at least through K through 12, if not further. And another question about the Taliban have said that women will get their rights according to Sharia law. So the question is what that means. But my kind of sub-question follow-up to that is whether there are women and women's organizations that are working to make arguments using Sharia law for particular rights or freedoms for women under the Taliban. So either of you can jump in for that question. Do either of you have something you'd like to say?
Yeah, probably both of us, but go ahead, Manizha. John, you can start.
Okay, so first of all, if we want our just education, from K to 12, if it doesn't have anything at the end, if you are not able to continue to your higher education, if you cannot have dreams of any profession that you would like to take over after that, then the motivation for even doing that would be lower, would be even nothing. Again, we'll go back to those years that all of us worked so hard for the last 20 years to change those stereotypes in Afghanistan, those stereotypes of what women, what girls can do, should do, and can be done, and changed mentalities of parents, fathers, not only in the bigger cities, but also in the smaller cities, where parents became ready, first of all, to send their daughters to school, second of all, to allow them to see dreams of whatever they can and want to be in the future. So really, it would not be, for me, it would not be only to negotiate that. For me, it would be to negotiate all the way that we have had it in the last 20 years. And we have had women in sports, we have had women in media, we have had women in almost everything, and women in politics and women in business. So just women in business, the sectors that they have had started and entered in, such as IT, media services, exporting, manufacturing, fashion, a lot of very modern clothing companies, jewelry production companies, dry fruits processing in a very different way from what men were doing. Men were putting our dry fruits in sacks and boxes, and they were exporting. But women brought a change in the whole sector of dry fruits in Afghanistan. They first they were the pioneers to start packaging in smaller packets and export it. And when they started, this is what men learned. And when we started talking about it, that hey, you cannot export anymore our dry fruits in big sacks and just have it and take the value to other countries to be processed further. We want the value to be kept in Afghanistan. So let's do value addition in Afghanistan and then export it. So this is what we want to continue. We don't want to, only negotiate for this. Even, as I said, not in education, not in business, and not in any other field. And with Sharia interpretation, what Taliban are emphasizing on, that yes, they can and they will be allowed to do whatever they want to based on Sharia. The problem is that everyone has different interpretation of Sharia. I wish that there was one interpretation of Sharia. We know all these Islamic countries, starting from our own neighbors, Pakistan, Iran, and then going all the way to the Middle East, all of them. UAE is an Islamic country. Qatar is an Islamic country that's providing major support to Taliban at this moment. And Saudi Arabia, everyone, Egypt. Look what's happening in all those countries. What women are not able to do in those countries? Tell me. They're able to do everything. They can dream. They can be part of any profession they want to. And there are women in any profession today in those Islamic countries. So if there was one interpretation of Islam, and if these people would have come and imposed that on us, and if they had replicated from all other and had learned it from all other developed Islamic countries, we might have had not this problem today.
That's a great point. And I think that your point about the innovations that women have made and the gains in jobs for women and the impact that has had is such an important point. When I was preparing for this chat, I reached out to a researcher I know in London who researches all over the world what makes the difference for women's empowerment. And she said that very often, particularly in very kind of patriarchal cultures with a strong honor-based kind of cultural norms, there's essentially been a process of almost buying that out, where once there are sufficient economic opportunities for women, that becomes an incentive to give them education, to allow them to delay marriage. Once they have some economic freedom, they have more leverage to gain freedoms in their personal lives. So I think that's such an important point. And it's something that I know you have been working on directly, but is I think maybe getting a little bit left out of this conversation, kind of the way that this works at the individual level for particular families.
Yes, and trust me, I'll give Rina John the opportunity. I'm sorry that I'm jumping in again. Trust me, this group of women that I've worked with and I'm in touch with, and I'm still trying to help and see what can be the opportunities to really negotiate our position. These women, they have invested. They did not receive any support. They were not employed. They invested. They started from selling their jewelry to start a business. They started from savings of their families, from savings of their former jobs. And so, these women, these are totally another group, and I have a totally different respect for them, because they had a different courage of putting in their money, their efforts, creating jobs for themselves, for others. And so if I tell you a few stories, if we have had time, you would have seen, their courage. Only the week that Herat fell down, one of our businesswomen who owns a beauty salon in Kabul, a huge and very luxury one, and a jewelry making company, she went and opened her second branch in Mazar. She was still hopeful that everything will be pushed back and Afghanistan will be the same as it was. I mean, none of us were expecting that this will happen in just a matter of weeks from Herat falling down to Kabul. So despite of us telling her that, hey, wait on the launch, she said, I have already invested between $50,000 to $100,000. She said something, $70,000 or $80,000. I cannot wait. I have to open my salon, and I have to open it to services. And in a week time, everything was gone. Yeah. And another woman, she has purchased about 10 tons of dry fruits that's ready for shipment, and it's for consignment. She had orders. And so she's just like sitting right now. How can I send this to my clients, to England, to UAE, and to all other European countries that she's been selling to?
Yeah, thank you for sharing those stories. That's so illustrative of what individuals are going through. Rina, can we turn over to you? You can address the questions that were raised a few minutes ago.
Sure, I'll be very brief. I mean, I would just introduce one caveat, is that maybe not everyone took that education opportunity. There were parts of the country where people allowed their children only to go to 6th grade education. But I don't want to sugarcoat how it was also challenging in the last 20 years. But what would be different this time is if the Taliban imposed a national decree preventing women from education beyond a certain level, that removes any possibility or hope and many throughout the country for something different. I mean, I've seen in the last 20 years, like Manizha John said, the evolution of people's thinking, including in very traditional areas where I would go and people would, very traditional elements would come and appeal to me to bring donors to so that they can start a girls' school, because for them it was very pragmatic. And this is what's missing in people's perceptions of Afghanistan. They think that Afghans are deeply traditional and ideological. I would say that the two distinct characteristics of Afghans is resilience and pragmatism. And that pragmatism is what guides their desire now to educate their daughters. And then on the point of sharia, just as to what Manizha John said, what many women point out is this is exactly what the Taliban said in the 1990s. According to sharia, what they're not explaining to us is how has your definition of sharia changed? And that would be the key.
Right. How their definition has changed, and I think also who they will listen to in arguments about how that definition should change, and what interpretations should hold. I agree.
They take the position that they have the monopoly and interpretation. Afghanistan is the Islamic Republic. The third article of the Constitution notes the primacy of Islam, and every woman that I know in some way negotiated her rights within the framework of Islam.
Right. Yeah, I feel like all over the world, women are having to negotiate their rights in frameworks set up for men, basically. So that is something, the specifics vary, but the problem is unfortunately, I think, quite universal. I'm in Texas today, where, of course, the Supreme Court has just allowed a essentially total abortion ban to stand. And it has been a real reminder that, obviously we should turn our focus and energy as much as possible to places with severe crises, but also to remember that these are problems that societies all over the world struggle with, even in places where women do have a lot of freedom, education, opportunities. There are still negotiations that we have to make for to be able to be considered full citizens and have full citizenship rights. So on the last question, before we wrap up, we have had several audience questions about what the international community can do to help, ranging from what they can do to bring pressure on the Taliban to what they can do to help individual refugees. That's obviously a very broad question, but I wonder if each of you could say a couple of things that you are looking for from the international community and that you hope might make a difference for women in Afghanistan. Rina, do you want to go first since you had?
Sure. I mean, I think there's several things that can be done. One is don't change the narrative. In the last 2 years, the US and the international community has shifted from 18 years of saying women's rights is a priority to saying it's an internal Afghan issue. And that downgrading was very, very strategically done because it enabled an exit without having to confront these issues. I mean, the fact that the peace agreement had no inclusion of Afghans, let alone Afghan women, it was just the Taliban and the Afghan government is very, very telling. And as we move forward, there's going to be a need to learn from that lesson and to really take stock of the choices that are being made by the international community in terms of its own foreign policy, but also the choices being made for Afghans. So if the decision is made to again make expedient choices, there's a reflection also back to the U.S. and the West in terms of where is your what is the U.S. without its convictions? What is the U.S. without its principles? And the West, quite frankly, it's not an imposition to bring that into Afghanistan. There's something very essentialist to say that human rights and women's rights is a Western concept. It is not. These Afghans believe in human rights and believe in women's rights. Human rights, and so we should see that it's not Western rights, it's human rights, and that we were both in the international and the broader international community need to protect those rights by setting up institutions, working with the multilateral framework. Right now, there's a number of decisions that are coming up. The UN UNAMA, which is the mission in Afghanistan, its mandate is being considered. And it has a core human rights element to it in terms of activities that should be maintained and protected. The UN Human Rights Council is negotiating this issue as well. And what has been called for by the High Commissioner of Human Rights is the establishment of a monitoring mechanism. That's going to be really important. In terms of refugees, what I want the world to know is that these people did not want to leave their homes. These women did not, they were their leaders, it's their identity, their home, their world, that they had to leave with just a small bag. They've left everything behind. And these are the best and brightest from Afghanistan. So they should be treated for the courageous people that they are, embraced and supported. And finally, I'm going to make a pitch for a couple of organizations that are fundraising to help these women. The Georgetown Institute has, if you go to their website, they are doing enormous work to support women in the short, medium, and long term. The Open Society Foundation, and there's a number of other organizations that are also listed on those sites where you can provide funding. Thank you.
Thank you. And Manizha, if you could answer the same question, what the international community can do right now.
Yes, I think Rina John, she put very well that don't change the narrative. And this is what we, all of us saw that happened. But from now on, not only that it's our responsibility not to change the narrative, that it's just Afghans' responsibility, but also we have to reiterate that this is the international community's responsibility to continue watching, monitoring what's happening next in Afghanistan in terms of, first of all, the inclusive government that Taliban are talking about, whether their inclusive government will include women, or are they just talking about just tribal inclusivity and other aspects of inclusivity in their governance. And second of all, yes, aid, we would like the aid to be conditioned, development aid to be conditioned. We definitely need humanitarian aid to go in Afghanistan without any condition, because we cannot have our children die now at homes because of hunger. They were being killed in explosions and bombs, and now there would be a time in the next few months where they will die because of hunger. So please, the humanitarian aid should go in without any condition, but the development aid should be conditioned on all of these issues and topics that we just spoke, especially women's position, human rights, and so on. And so my last thing that I have always, not only now, but I've always spoken about it in the past, that please consider us as your partners, not as your AIDS beneficiaries. When you consider us as your AIDS beneficiaries, then it's totally different. You just put together your programs and just come in and implement it on us. But if you consider us your partners, then you will do it together with us. And Afghans will own it, will sustain it, and will continue it. So please, if our international partners do not think that, okay, now everybody is out of Afghanistan and now again, they have to put together programs themselves and just go and implement it in Afghanistan without any Afghans in partnership, that would be, again, I'm sure, a big mistake, and a lot of resources will be, again, unfortunately wasted, and things will remain as a bubble. Fancy things will happen, but then nothing fundamental to really change the core of the society and core of what should remain in that country as substantials for the people of Afghanistan. So please consider us as your partners for all the development that's going to happen next in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that's a wonderful note to end on. I would just like to thank the audience. My understanding is that we have seen an absolute outpouring of questions and interest in this topic, which I think is wonderful to see. So thank you all so much for watching and for your active engagement and asking questions. Thank you to our two speakers who have been so eloquent and so informative to this group about what is going on. and what we might be seeing in the future, and importantly, what we should be looking for and what can be done. I'd like to thank the Women's Forum in particular, and to say that we look forward to seeing many of you at the Women's Forum Global Meeting in November. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.